My name is Serena Martinez, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a pediatric nurse at Children's Memorial Hospital, where I've spent the last 6 years helping families through their darkest moments. I've held the hands of parents watching their children fight for life, I've celebrated recoveries that defied medical odds, and I've learned to recognize the difference between accidents and something far more sinister. But nothing in my professional experience prepared me for the moment I had to use those same skills to save my own life from the person who was supposed to protect me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October when my world shattered on the corner of Maple Street and Fifth Avenue. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the sidewalks in shades of gold and crimson. I remember thinking how beautiful the day was as I walked toward the crosswalk, my scrubs still smelling faintly of hospital antiseptic from my morning shift. My brother Marcus was beside me, talking about some new investment opportunity he was convinced would make him rich. At 32, he still lived in our parents' basement, bouncing between get-rich-quick schemes and blaming everyone else for his failures. We were heading to lunch at the corner café, where we'd been meeting monthly for the past 2 years. It was my attempt to maintain some connection with my family, despite the growing tension that seemed to follow Marcus wherever he went. As we approached the intersection, the light turned yellow. I slowed my pace, but Marcus grabbed my arm, urging me forward. "Come on, Serena, we can make it," he said. His grip was firm, almost aggressive, and something in his tone made me hesitate. That hesitation saved my life. Because what happened next wasn't an accident, wasn't rough play, and wasn't the tragic mishap my family would later claim it to be. In the span of 3 seconds, my brother's hands connected with my back in a violent shove that sent me stumbling directly into the path of an oncoming delivery truck. The screech of brakes, the smell of burning rubber, and the horrified screams of bystanders created a symphony of chaos that still echoes in my nightmares. The truck stopped less than 2 feet from where I lay sprawled on the asphalt, my knees scraped and bleeding, my hands trembling as adrenaline flooded my system. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and shaking hands, jumped from his cab and knelt beside me, asking if I was hurt, if I needed an ambulance. Behind me, I could hear Marcus's voice, loud and theatrical, explaining to the gathering crowd how I had tripped, how he had tried to grab me but was too late, how clumsy his little sister had always been. But there was someone else there that day, someone whose presence would change everything. Mrs. Eleanor Chen had been sitting on the bench outside the post office, feeding pigeons and enjoying the warm afternoon sun. At 73, she was sharp-eyed and sharp-minded, a retired court stenographer who had spent decades watching people lie under oath. She had seen the entire incident unfold from her vantage point, 15 feet away, and what she witnessed was not an accident. The immediate aftermath of what my family would call my accident played out like a carefully choreographed performance. Marcus transformed from the person who had just tried to kill me into the concerned older brother, his voice carrying just the right note of panic as he helped me to my feet. "Are you okay? Oh my God, Serena, I'm so sorry. I tried to catch you when you stumbled, but I wasn't fast enough." His hands were gentle now, supportive, the same hands that had struck me between the shoulder blades with enough force to send me flying. The police arrived within minutes, their patrol car sliding to a stop with lights flashing but no sirens. Officer Rebecca Walsh was the first to approach, her notebook already in hand as she began taking statements from witnesses. She was thorough and professional, asking each person to describe what they had seen without leading questions or assumptions. Most of the bystanders had only noticed the aftermath, the moment when I was already falling, already in danger. Their statements would later reflect Marcus's version of events, painting a picture of a tragic stumble and a brother's failed attempt to help. But Mrs. Chen was different. When Officer Walsh approached her bench, the elderly woman looked up with clear, determined eyes and said something that made the officer pause and write more carefully. I watched from where I sat on the curb, Marcus hovering beside me with manufactured concern, as Mrs. Chen spoke quietly but firmly to the policewoman. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw Officer Walsh glance in our direction several times, her expression growing more serious with each exchange. The paramedics arrived shortly after, their ambulance blocking traffic as they checked me for injuries. My knees were scraped and my palms were raw from breaking my fall, but physically, I had escaped largely unharmed. Emotionally, however, I was beginning to unravel. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a growing awareness of what had actually happened and a creeping dread about what it meant for my relationship with my family. Marcus rode with me to the hospital, playing the role of the devoted brother with Academy Award precision. He called our parents from the ambulance, his voice breaking as he described the terrible accident and how scared he had been when he saw me fall. He held my hand during the examination, asked thoughtful questions about my treatment, and even brought me a cup of coffee from the vending machine. To anyone watching, he appeared to be exactly what a loving sibling should be in a crisis. But I knew better. In the quiet moments between his performances, when he thought no one was looking, I caught glimpses of something else in his expression. Not relief that I was safe, not genuine concern for my well-being, but calculation. He was already working through his story, refining the details, preparing for questions that might come later. It was the same look I had seen on his face during childhood when he broke something valuable and was planning how to blame me or our younger cousin. My parents arrived at the hospital within an hour, my mother Elena rushing through the emergency room doors with tears in her eyes, and my father Roberto close behind, his face grave with worry. They embraced me carefully, mindful of my bandaged palms, and listened as Marcus recounted the story he had already told multiple times. Each retelling was consistent, polished, and completely fabricated. According to Marcus, we had been walking to lunch when I suddenly lurched forward, apparently catching my foot on an uneven piece of sidewalk. He claimed he had reached out to steady me, but was unable to prevent my fall into the street. The delivery truck, he said, had been approaching the intersection at a reasonable speed and had managed to stop just in time thanks to the driver's quick reflexes and divine intervention. It was, he concluded, a terrible accident that could have happened to anyone. My mother wept openly at the thought of how close she had come to losing me. My father, ever practical, wanted to know about insurance coverage and whether we should consider legal action against the city for maintaining unsafe sidewalks. Neither of them questioned Marcus's account or asked me for my version of events. In their minds, the story was complete and acceptable, a random tragedy that had thankfully ended well. But I remembered the feeling of his hands against my back, the deliberate force of his push, the split second of surprise I had felt when I realized what was happening. I remembered the look in his eyes just before he made contact, a cold determination that had nothing to do with playfulness or accident. Most importantly, I remembered that Mrs.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Chen had been watching, and from her conversation with Officer Walsh, I suspected she had seen the same thing I had felt. The next few days passed in a haze of family attention and well-meaning concern. Marcus visited daily, bringing flowers and magazines, regaling me with updates about the investigation and his ongoing trauma from witnessing such a close call. My parents hovered constantly, discussing my care and recovery as if I were still a child, rather than a grown woman with a demanding career and an independent life. The story spread through our extended family and social circles with the speed of wildfire. My Aunt Carmen called from Phoenix to express her horror at my near miss. My cousin David drove up from San Diego with a care package and a lecture about being more careful around traffic. Even my ex-boyfriend Thomas, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a year, sent a text expressing his relief that I was safe. Everyone had heard the same version of events, filtered through my parents and refined by Marcus's natural storytelling ability. I was the clumsy little sister who had stumbled at the worst possible moment. He was the heroic big brother who had tried unsuccessfully to save me from my own awkwardness. The truck driver was a skilled professional who had prevented a tragedy through quick thinking and superior vehicle control. It was a neat, tidy narrative that explained everything while implicating no one. Except it was completely false. The turning point came on Thursday evening when Officer Walsh called my cell phone directly. She explained that she was conducting follow-up interviews with everyone involved in the incident and wondered if I might have time to speak with her privately, away from family members who might inadvertently influence my recollection of events. Her tone was professional, but carried an undercurrent of something more, a suggestion that there were aspects of the case she wanted to explore more thoroughly. We arranged to meet the following morning at a quiet coffee shop downtown, far from the hospital, and the neighborhood where my family might recognize us together. I told my parents I was going to run errands and would be back by lunch, a half-truth that felt necessary given the growing complexity of the situation. Marcus offered to drive me, citing concern about my stability after the trauma, but I declined, claiming I needed some independence to begin my emotional recovery. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few early morning regulars reading newspapers and checking their phones. Officer Walsh was already there, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance and exit. She was younger than I had initially thought, probably in her mid-30s, with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested years of experience dealing with difficult situations. She began by asking about my physical recovery and whether I was experiencing any ongoing symptoms from the incident. I assured her that my injuries were minor and healing well, though I admitted to some lingering anxiety about crossing streets and a general feeling of unease that I couldn't quite shake. She nodded understandingly and made notes in a small leather portfolio, her handwriting neat and precise. Then she asked the question I had been both dreading and hoping for since Tuesday afternoon. "Serena, I want you to think carefully about the moments just before you ended up in the street. Can you walk me through exactly what happened from your perspective?" I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, forcing myself to relive those terrifying seconds with complete honesty. I described the feeling of Marcus's grip on my arm as we approached the intersection, the way he had urged me forward despite the changing light, and most importantly, the unmistakable sensation of being pushed from behind with deliberate force. When I opened my eyes, Officer Walsh was watching me intently, her pen still poised above her notebook. "Are you absolutely certain that what you felt was a push rather than an attempt to grab or steady you?" she asked carefully. "I'm certain," I replied without hesitation. "I know what it feels like to be helped, and I know what it feels like to be hurt. This was intentional." Officer Walsh leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. Then she reached into her portfolio and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she placed on the table between us. "Mrs. Eleanor Chen provided a written statement about what she observed on Tuesday afternoon," she said quietly. "I think you should read it." My hands shook slightly as I unfolded the paper and began to read Mrs. Chen's precise, detailed account of the incident. She had been sitting approximately 15 feet away with an unobstructed view of the intersection when she noticed two people approaching the crosswalk. She described seeing the man grab the woman's arm and pull her forward, despite her apparent reluctance to proceed. She noted that the traffic light had already changed and that continuing across would be dangerous. Then came the crucial paragraph that made my heart race and my stomach clench with a mixture of vindication and terror. Mrs. Chen had clearly observed the man place both hands against the woman's back and shove her forcefully into the path of the oncoming truck. She stated that the action appeared deliberate and aggressive, not accidental or playful in nature. She emphasized that the woman had shown no signs of stumbling or losing her balance prior to being pushed. The statement concluded with Mrs. Chen's assertion that she had immediately recognized the incident as an assault rather than an accident, and her recommendation that the matter be investigated as a potential attempted homicide. She provided her contact information and indicated her willingness to testify if formal charges were brought against the perpetrator. I sat in stunned silence for several minutes, reading and rereading Mrs. Chen's words as the full implications of her testimony sank in. Someone had seen the truth. Someone had witnessed Marcus's attack and was willing to speak publicly about what they had observed. For the first time since Tuesday afternoon, I felt less alone and less crazy. Officer Walsh watched me process the information before speaking again. "Mrs. Chen is a very credible witness," she said. "She worked in the court system for over 40 years and has an excellent reputation for accuracy and honesty. Her statement carries significant weight, especially combined with your own account of what happened." "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That depends partly on you," Officer Walsh replied. I can continue investigating this as an assault case, but I'll need your full cooperation and your willingness to press charges if the evidence supports it. I should warn you that this will be difficult for your family and may strain relationships that are important to you. I thought about my parents, already traumatized by the thought of losing me, and how they would react to learning that their son had deliberately tried to harm their daughter. I considered the extended family gatherings that would become impossible, the holidays that would be forever tainted by suspicion and anger, the fundamental trust that would be shattered if the truth came out. Then I thought about Marcus, still playing the role of concerned brother, while privately knowing exactly what he had done and why he had done it. I thought about the calculation in his eyes, the practiced ease with which he had constructed his lies, and the chilling realization that if Mrs. Chen hadn't been there, he would have gotten away with attempted murder. I want to press charges, I said firmly. Whatever the cost to my family, I can't let this go. He tried to kill me, and he's been lying about it ever since. That can't be okay. Officer Walsh nodded and made another note in her portfolio. There's something else you should know, she said. When I ran a background check on your brother, some interesting things came to light. He's been involved in several insurance disputes over the years, including a suspicious car accident in 2019 and a workplace injury claim that was ultimately denied for inconsistencies in his story. She paused and met my eyes directly. There's also a restraining order filed against him by an ex-girlfriend in 2020. She claimed he had threatened her and engaged in stalking behavior after their relationship ended. The order was temporary and wasn't renewed, but the initial complaint was quite detailed. This information hit me like a physical blow. I had known Marcus could be difficult and manipulative, but I had never suspected he might have a pattern of violence or threatening behavior toward women. The idea that he might have hurt someone else, or that his attack on me was part of a larger pattern of aggression, made me feel sick to my stomach. Why would he want to hurt me? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Officer Walsh hesitated before responding. That's something we'll need to investigate further, but in my experience, family violence often has complex motives. Financial disputes, jealousy, mental illness, substance abuse, or simply a desire to control and punish can all play a role. As I sat there absorbing this new information, my phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. Hey sis, just wanted to check on you this morning. Mom said you went out to run errands. Hope you're feeling strong enough for that. See you later today. The casual tone, the manufactured concern, the subtle probing about my activities suddenly felt sinister rather than caring. I showed the message to Officer Walsh, who photographed it with her phone and added it to her growing file on the case. From now on, I want you to be very careful about your interactions with your brother, she said seriously. Don't meet with him alone, don't go anywhere isolated with him, and try to avoid situations where he might feel threatened or cornered. If he realizes we're investigating him, there's no telling how he might react. The weight of living under threat from my own family member settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had entered the coffee shop hoping to find answers and validation. Instead, I was leaving with the knowledge that my brother was not only dangerous, but potentially part of a larger pattern of violence that I was only beginning to understand. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Chen and her courage in speaking the truth despite the potential consequences. She was a stranger who owed me nothing, yet she had been willing to get involved in what was clearly going to be a messy and complicated situation. Her statement had given me hope, but it had also opened a door that could never be closed again. The next phase of this ordeal was about to begin, and I had no idea how far the truth would take me or what it would cost my family in the process. All I knew for certain was that I could no longer pretend Tuesday afternoon had been an accident, and I could no longer trust the person who had been supposed to protect me from harm rather than cause it. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, Marcus's car was already there. Through the kitchen window, I could see him sitting at the familiar wooden table where we had shared countless family meals, probably regaling our parents with another version of his heroic story. The sight filled me with a combination of rage and sadness that threatened to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering the strength to walk into that house and pretend everything was normal while secretly planning the downfall of someone I had once loved unconditionally. It was a performance I would have to maintain until Officer Walsh had enough evidence to make an arrest, a delicate balance between protecting myself and protecting the investigation that would ultimately determine whether justice would be served. The hardest part was knowing that by the time this was over, my family as I had known it would cease to exist. The truth has a way of destroying illusions, and some illusions are so fundamental to a family's identity that their collapse brings everything else down with them. But Mrs. Chen's witness statement had made one thing crystal clear. The alternative to pursuing the truth was living with a lie that could literally be a matter of life and death. As I finally got out of my car and walked toward the house where my would-be killer was waiting with hugs and false concern, I whispered a silent thank you to a brave elderly woman I barely knew, whose willingness to speak up had given me the courage to fight for my own life and dignity. The real battle was just beginning. The investigation into what my family continued to call my accident began in earnest the following Monday morning. Officer Walsh had spent the weekend reviewing security footage from nearby businesses and interviewing additional witnesses who might have observed the incident from different angles. What she discovered would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the case and expose layers of deception I never could have imagined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the traffic camera mounted at the intersection of Maple Street and Fifth Avenue. The city's traffic management system automatically recorded all major intersections for analysis of flow patterns and accident reconstruction. Officer Walsh had requested the footage as a routine part of her investigation, expecting to find confirmation of the basic facts, but not necessarily the kind of detailed evidence that would make or break the case. When she called me Tuesday morning, her voice carried a tension I hadn't heard before. "Serena, I need you to come to the station as soon as possible. There's something I need to show you, and I think it's going to change everything we thought we knew about what happened." I arrived at the police station within an hour, my nerves jangling with anticipation and dread. The building was a typical municipal structure, all concrete and fluorescent lighting, but Officer Walsh's office felt surprisingly warm and personal. Family photos lined her desk, and a small plant struggled gamely in the artificial light filtering through the narrow windows. She gestured for me to sit in the chair facing her computer monitor, then pulled up a video file with Tuesday's date and the timestamp showing 1:47 p.m. "I'm going to show you the traffic camera footage from your incident," she explained. "It's not the highest quality, but it's clear enough to see what actually happened. Are you ready for this?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure anyone could truly be ready to watch their own attempted murder played out in grainy digital format. Officer Walsh clicked play, and I watched myself and Marcus approach the intersection from the camera's elevated perspective. Even with the limited resolution, our body language was clearly visible. The footage showed Marcus gripping my arm more tightly than I had remembered, his posture aggressive rather than casual. When we reached the crosswalk, I could see myself hesitate as the light changed, my body language indicating reluctance to proceed. Marcus continued pulling me forward, and then came the moment that made my blood run cold. Even from the camera's distant viewpoint, Marcus's actions were unmistakably deliberate. He positioned himself behind me, placed both hands against my back, and shoved me forward with enough force that his own body moved backward from the effort. There was no stumble on my part, no reaching gesture on his to catch me, no indication of anything accidental about what transpired. The truck's brakes screamed as I tumbled into the street, and Marcus immediately moved to the edge of the crosswalk, his arms extended in what appeared to be a gesture of helpless concern. By the time other people reached the scene, he had already begun his performance as the distraught brother who had failed to save his clumsy sister from her own mishap. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my hands shaking as I watched the replay of my near-death experience. "It's all right there. Everything he said was a lie." Officer Walsh paused the video and turned to face me directly. "This footage, combined with Mrs. Chen's eyewitness testimony and your own statement, gives us more than enough evidence to file charges. But before we proceed, there's something else I need to tell you about your brother's background." She opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across her desk. Police reports, insurance claims, medical records, and what appeared to be psychiatric evaluations created a mosaic of Marcus's troubled history that I had never suspected existed. "Your brother has been involved in 7 suspicious incidents over the past 8 years," Officer Walsh began, her finger tracing a timeline she had constructed from the various reports. 3 insurance claims for accidents that investigators couldn't quite prove were fraudulent, but that contained enough inconsistencies to raise red flags. 2 workplace injury claims that were ultimately denied after surveillance showed him engaging in activities that should have been impossible given his alleged injuries. She flipped to another section of the file. "There's also the restraining order I mentioned, but it turns out there were 2 others that were filed but never served. One ex-girlfriend, 2 former coworkers, all claiming harassment and threatening behavior. And here's the most disturbing part. Officer Walsh pulled out a psychiatric evaluation dated 3 years earlier, the result of a court-ordered assessment following one of the workplace incidents. The psychologist's conclusions made my skin crawl as I read them. Marcus displayed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, including a lack of empathy, a tendency toward manipulation and deception, and what the doctor described as an unusual comfort with physical violence as a means of problem-solving. The psychologist recommended ongoing therapy and suggested that Marcus posed a potential danger to family members and intimate partners," Officer Walsh continued. "The recommendation was apparently ignored, and there's no record of him following through with any kind of treatment." I stared at the documents spread before me, trying to reconcile this clinical portrait of a dangerous individual with the brother I thought I knew. Marcus had always been selfish and manipulative, but I had attributed those traits to immaturity and poor decision-making rather than genuine psychological pathology. The idea that he might actually be incapable of normal human empathy reframed every interaction we had ever had. "Why would he want to hurt me specifically?" I asked, though I was beginning to fear I already knew the answer. Officer Walsh pulled out another document, this one a financial report that made my heart sink. "We obtained a warrant to examine your brother's financial records, and what we found explains a lot about his possible motivation. Marcus is in significant debt: credit cards, personal loans, gambling losses, unpaid rent to your parents. He owes approximately $180,000 to various creditors, and several of them have begun legal proceedings to collect." She pointed to a specific entry in the financial analysis. 3 weeks ago, Marcus took out a life insurance policy on you, a substantial policy, with himself listed as the primary beneficiary. The room seemed to spin around me as the full implication of this revelation sank in. Marcus hadn't pushed me into traffic in a moment of anger or mental breakdown. He had planned it, calculated the potential payout, and executed what he believed would be the perfect murder disguised as a tragic accident. If Mrs. Chen hadn't been sitting on that bench, if the traffic camera hadn't captured his actions, if I had died as he intended, he would have collected a substantial insurance payout while playing the grieving brother at my funeral. "I'm going to be sick," I managed to say, bolting from the chair toward the small bathroom attached to Officer Walsh's office. I barely made it before my stomach rebelled against the horror of what I had learned. Marcus hadn't just tried to kill me on impulse. He had made me a business transaction, a financial solution to his debt problems. When I returned to the office, Officer Walsh had prepared a glass of water and a box of tissues. Her expression was sympathetic but professional, the look of someone who had delivered similar devastating news to other families caught in webs of violence and betrayal. "I know this is overwhelming," she said gently, "but we need to discuss how to proceed from here. With the evidence we have, I'm confident we can secure charges for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. The district attorney's office has already reviewed the preliminary materials and agreed to fast-track the case." "What happens to my family when this comes out?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the full scope of what we were about to unleash. Officer Walsh leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "Family violence cases are always difficult because they destroy the fundamental assumptions that hold families together. Your parents are going to have to confront the fact that one of their children tried to murder the other for money. That's not something people recover from easily or quickly. She was right, of course, but the alternative was allowing Marcus to remain free or to target someone else when his financial situation became desperate enough. The insurance policy proved that my accident had been a calculated business decision rather than an emotional outburst, which meant he was capable of similar calculations in the future. "There's one more thing," Officer Walsh continued. "We're going to need to arrest Marcus, but we want to do it in a way that maximizes our chances of getting a confession or at least additional evidence. I'd like to arrange a controlled conversation between you and your brother, something recorded where he might admit to what he did." The thought of sitting across from Marcus, knowing what I now knew about his true nature and his intentions, filled me with a terror I had never experienced before. But I also understood that a recorded confession would eliminate any possibility of the case devolving into a he-said-she-said situation that might allow him to escape justice. "How would that work?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "We would wire you with a recording device and have backup officers positioned nearby for your safety. The goal would be to get him talking about the incident, maybe by expressing doubts about his version of events or by suggesting you remember things differently than he described them." People with antisocial personality disorder often can't resist the urge to explain how clever they've been, especially when they think they're safe. I spent the rest of that day considering Officer Walsh's proposal while trying to maintain normal interactions with my family. Marcus called twice to check on my recovery, his voice warm with manufactured concern. My mother stopped by with homemade soup and the latest updates from relatives who had heard about my accident. My father sent a text asking if I needed help with any household tasks while I was healing from my injuries. Their love and concern felt genuine and heartwarming, which made the knowledge of what I was about to put them through even more painful. By exposing Marcus's true nature, I would be destroying their faith in their own judgment, their trust in their family's fundamental safety, and their ability to process family gatherings and shared memories without the shadow of attempted murder hanging over everything. But the alternative was living a lie that could literally kill me or someone else. The insurance policy proved that Marcus viewed violence as a practical solution to his problems, and his psychological profile suggested he was unlikely to develop genuine remorse or empathy that might prevent future attacks. If I remained silent to protect my parents' feelings, I might be signing someone else's death warrant. That evening, I called Officer Walsh and agreed to the controlled conversation. We scheduled it for Thursday afternoon at my apartment, a location where Marcus would feel comfortable and unguarded. The recording equipment would be concealed, and backup officers would be positioned in the building's lobby and parking garage, close enough to intervene quickly if the situation became dangerous. Wednesday passed in a haze of nervous preparation and mounting dread. I rehearsed potential conversation starters and responses, trying to anticipate how Marcus might react to different approaches. Officer Walsh provided coaching on how to encourage him to elaborate on his statements without seeming suspicious, and how to recognize warning signs that he might be becoming violent or threatening. The hardest part was maintaining normal family interactions while internally preparing to destroy everything we had built together. Marcus called that evening to suggest we have lunch on Thursday, a proposal that fit perfectly with our investigation timeline, but filled me with such anxiety that I could barely speak coherently during our conversation. Thursday morning arrived gray and rainy, the kind of dreary weather that seemed to match the grimness of what lay ahead. Officer Walsh arrived at my apartment an hour early to set up the recording equipment and brief me on safety protocols. The wire was smaller than I had expected, barely noticeable once it was properly positioned, but its presence felt heavy with the weight of what it represented. "Remember," Officer Walsh said as she tested the audio levels, "your safety is more important than getting a confession. If he becomes threatening or violent, use the code word headache and we'll come in immediately. Don't try to be a hero or push him too hard if he seems to be getting agitated." At exactly noon, Marcus knocked on my apartment door, carrying takeout bags from our favorite Thai restaurant and wearing the expression of loving concern that I now recognized as a carefully constructed mask. "Hey sis," he said, embracing me gently and asking about my pain levels and recovery progress. "I thought some comfort food might help you feel better." We settled at my kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten countless meals while studying for nursing school, where I had celebrated job promotions and commiserated about relationship failures. Now it felt like a stage set for a performance that would determine whether justice would be served or whether Marcus would continue to believe he could literally get away with murder. For the first 20 minutes, our conversation remained safely superficial. Marcus updated me on family gossip, discussed his latest job search efforts, and expressed optimism about some new business opportunities he was pursuing. His demeanor was relaxed and affectionate, giving no hint of the calculated killer I now knew him to be. Then I took the first calculated risk. "Marcus, I've been having some strange dreams about Tuesday," I said carefully. "Sometimes I wake up feeling like I remember things differently than we talked about at the hospital." His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle stiffening that suggested increased alertness. "What kind of things?" he asked, his tone still casual, but with an undertone of watchfulness that hadn't been there before. "I keep having this feeling like someone pushed me," I continued, watching his face for any telltale reactions. "I know that sounds crazy, and I'm sure it's just trauma playing tricks with my memory, but the sensation feels so real." Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced and slightly too loud. "Serena, you know how unreliable memory can be after a traumatic experience. Your brain is probably trying to make sense of something that happened too fast to process normally. You tripped, I tried to catch you but couldn't reach you in time, and now your subconscious is turning my failed rescue attempt into something more dramatic." "But it felt so deliberate," I pressed, maintaining eye contact to gauge his reaction. "Like someone meant to hurt me." For just a moment, Marcus's mask slipped. I caught a flash of something cold and calculating in his eyes, a brief glimpse of the person who had taken out a life insurance policy on his sister and planned her murder for financial gain. Then the concerned brother expression returned, but I had seen enough to confirm that Officer Walsh's instincts were correct. "Serena, I think you should talk to someone about these feelings," Marcus said, reaching across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that now felt sinister rather than comforting. "Trauma can really mess with your head, and these false memories could become a real problem if you start believing them." "Maybe you're right," I replied, allowing some doubt to creep into my voice. "It's just that Mrs. Chen, the lady who saw everything happen, seemed to think something was off about the whole situation." Marcus went very still, his hand freezing in place on top of mine. "What did Mrs. Chen say?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice carried a sharp edge that suggested genuine concern rather than manufactured sympathy. "She gave a statement to the police," I said, watching as Marcus's complexion grew noticeably paler. "Officer Walsh told me she described seeing someone push me rather than try to catch me." The transformation in Marcus's demeanor was startling and immediate. The loving brother mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. His grip on my hand tightened painfully, and when he spoke, his voice carried a menacing quality I had never heard before. "That old bitch doesn't know what she's talking about. She's probably half blind and confused. You can't seriously be considering believing some random stranger over your own brother?" "Marcus, you're hurting my hand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. He released my hand but leaned forward aggressively, invading my personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "Listen to me very carefully, Serena. That old woman is mistaken about what she thinks she saw. I was trying to help you, not hurt you. If you start spreading rumors and lies about what happened, you're going to destroy this family and ruin my life for no reason." "I'm not spreading rumors," I protested, recognizing that we had moved far beyond the gentle probing Officer Walsh had coached me to attempt. "I'm just trying to understand why my memory feels different from what you're telling everyone." Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back, his agitation increasing with each circuit around my small kitchen. "Your memory is wrong," he said flatly. "Whatever that old woman thinks she saw is wrong. The only truth is what I've been telling everyone, and if you know what's good for you, you'll stop questioning it." The threat was unmistakable, delivered in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather, but carrying an undertone of violence that made my skin crawl. This was the real Marcus, the person the psychological evaluation had identified as dangerous and potentially violent. The brother I had loved and trusted had been an illusion, a carefully constructed persona designed to hide someone capable of murder for financial gain. "Are you threatening me?" I asked, my hand moving instinctively toward the small panic button Officer Walsh had given me as a backup to the code word system. Marcus returned to his seat, but his posture remained aggressive, and his eyes had taken on a cold, calculating quality that reminded me of a predator evaluating potential prey. "I'm not threatening you," he said carefully. "I'm explaining reality. You had an accident. I tried to help. End of story. Any other version of events would be extremely damaging to everyone involved, especially me." "Damaging how?" I pressed, sensing that we were approaching the kind of revelation that would make the recording worthwhile despite the personal cost. "Do you have any idea what would happen to me if people started believing I had deliberately hurt you?" Marcus asked, his voice rising with what appeared to be genuine panic. "I'd lose any chance of getting decent employment. The family would disown me. I'd probably face criminal charges based on the word of some confused old woman and your traumatized imagination." He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than his earlier shouting. "And for what? To pursue some fantasy that your loving big brother tried to kill you? Does that even make sense to you?" "It would make sense if you were desperate enough for money," I said quietly, finally voicing the suspicion that had been growing since I learned about the insurance policy. The effect of my words was immediate and electric. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to anger to what looked like grudging admiration, as if he was impressed that I had figured out his motive despite his careful planning and execution. "You've been talking to the cops," he said, his tone flat and dangerous. "They told you about the policy." The admission hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Marcus had just confirmed not only that there was an insurance policy, but that he understood its significance to my accusations. "What policy?" I asked, trying to maintain the pretense that I was still gathering information rather than confirming what I already knew. Marcus laughed, but it was a bitter sound devoid of any humor. "Don't play dumb, Serena. If the cops told you enough to make you suspicious, they told you about the life insurance. And if you know about that, you probably know about my debts and all the rest of it." He stood up again, moving to the kitchen counter where my knife block sat within easy reach. The gesture might have been unconscious, but it sent a jolt of pure terror through my nervous system. We had moved far beyond the controlled conversation Officer Walsh had envisioned, into territory where Marcus might decide that eliminating me permanently was preferable to facing the consequences of his failed first attempt. "The thing is," Marcus continued, his back still turned as he examined my collection of kitchen knives, "you're putting me in an impossible situation. If you keep pushing this investigation, I'm going to prison. If I go to prison, I lose everything, and the debts destroy what's left of my life." He turned to face me, and I was horrified to see that he was holding my largest chef's knife, testing its weight and balance as if considering its potential applications. "But if something were to happen to you now, while you're still recovering from your traumatic accident, well, that would be a terrible tragedy, but not necessarily suspicious." "Marcus, put the knife down," I said, abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. "You don't want to make this worse than it already is." "Actually, I think I do want to make it worse," he replied conversationally. "See, the problem with my first plan was that it relied too much on chance. Traffic cameras, witnesses, police investigations, all variables I couldn't control. But this approach is much cleaner." He moved closer, the knife held casually, but positioned in a way that could become threatening in an instant. A depressed accident victim, struggling with trauma and false memories, takes her own life in a moment of despair. Very sad, very believable, and it solves all my problems while generating a lot of sympathy for the grieving brother who tried so hard to help her recover. The moment had arrived when my safety trumped any investigative goals. "I have a terrible headache," I said loudly, hoping the recording equipment was sensitive enough to pick up my words clearly. Marcus tilted his head, confused by the apparent non sequitur. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I have a terrible headache," I repeated, louder this time, as I heard the sound of heavy footsteps pounding up the stairwell outside my apartment. Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes just as my front door exploded inward and 3 police officers burst into the room with their weapons drawn. Drop the knife now, Officer Walsh shouted, her service pistol trained on Marcus's center mass. For a moment, I thought Marcus might actually try to fight, his grip tightening on the knife handle as he looked back and forth between the officers and me. Then his shoulders sagged in defeat, and he let the weapon clatter to the floor as his hands rose in surrender. "You set me up," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and fury. "You actually set me up." "No," I replied, as Officer Walsh moved to secure the knife and another officer began reading Marcus's rights.
You set yourself up when you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Marcus's wrists, he looked at me with an expression of pure hatred that contained no trace of the brother I had once loved. "This isn't over, Serena," he said quietly. "Prison isn't forever, and family is family." "Actually," Officer Walsh interjected as she guided Marcus toward the door, "given what we just recorded, along with the insurance fraud and premeditation we can now prove, you're looking at attempted murder in the first degree. In this state, that carries a sentence of 25 to life. So yeah, prison might actually be forever." After they had gone, taking Marcus away in handcuffs and leaving me alone in my violated apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to process what had just happened. The brother I had loved had not only tried to kill me once, but had been prepared to do it again to cover his tracks. The insurance money had been more important to him than my life, and my survival had been nothing more than an inconvenience to be rectified. The recording device was still transmitting when Officer Walsh returned an hour later to collect it and take my formal statement about the confrontation. As we reviewed what had been captured, I was amazed by how clearly Marcus's true nature had emerged once he felt cornered and desperate. This recording, combined with the traffic camera footage and Mrs. Chen's eyewitness testimony, gives us one of the strongest attempted murder cases I've ever worked, Officer Walsh said as she packaged the evidence for transfer to the district attorney's office. "Your brother is going to prison for a very long time." But as I sat in my empty apartment that evening, surrounded by the wreckage of my family's illusions and the knowledge that I would have to be the one to tell my parents what their son had really tried to do, I realized that justice was only the beginning of a much longer and more difficult process of healing and rebuilding. The hardest conversations of my life were still ahead of me, and the family I had known was gone forever, replaced by something smaller but more honest, built on truth rather than comfortable lies and willful blindness to the darkness that had been living among us all along. The phone call to my parents was the hardest conversation I've ever had to initiate. It was 9 p.m. when I finally gathered enough courage to dial their number, my hands trembling as I listened to the familiar ringtone that had once brought comfort but now filled me with dread. My father answered on the third ring, his voice warm and sleepy from his evening routine. "Serena, sweetheart, how are you feeling tonight?" he asked, and I could hear the television murmuring in the background, probably the evening news program he and my mother watched religiously every night after dinner. "Dad, I need you and Mom to sit down," I said, my voice barely steady. "There's something I have to tell you about what really happened on Tuesday, and it's going to be very difficult to hear." The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could hear him calling to my mother, asking her to turn off the television and come to the phone. When she picked up the extension, her voice carried the same concern and love it always had, making what I was about to say feel like the cruelest betrayal imaginable. "Mom, Dad, Marcus was arrested tonight," I began, and immediately heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. "He's been charged with attempted murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. He didn't try to save me from falling into traffic. He pushed me, deliberately, trying to kill me so he could collect on a life insurance policy he took out without my knowledge." The explosion of disbelief and denial that followed was exactly what I had expected, but no less painful for its predictability. My father's voice rose in anger, not at Marcus, but at me, demanding to know how I could make such terrible accusations against my own brother. My mother began crying immediately, insisting that there had to be some mistake, that Marcus would never hurt anyone, especially not his own sister. "This is insane, Serena," my father said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Marcus loves you. He's been worried sick about your recovery. There's no way he would ever do something like this." "Dad, I have proof," I said quietly, letting them vent their initial shock before providing the details that would make denial impossible. "There's video footage from the traffic camera showing him pushing me. There's a witness who saw the whole thing happen. There's the insurance policy and evidence of his financial problems. Tonight, he came to my apartment and threatened to kill me again when he realized the police were investigating." I spent the next hour walking them through every piece of evidence, every revelation about Marcus's psychological profile and criminal history, every detail of his calculated plan to murder me for money. With each new piece of information, I could hear their voices growing smaller and more broken, the reality of their son's true nature slowly penetrating their shock and disbelief. "Where is he now?" my mother finally whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "He's in county jail," I replied. "He'll be arraigned tomorrow morning, and given the evidence against him, his bail will probably be set very high or denied completely. Officer Walsh says he'll likely be in custody until the trial." The silence that followed was different from their earlier shocked quiet. This was the heavy, suffocating silence of a family trying to process the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. I could almost feel their world reshaping itself around this new reality, all their memories of Marcus now tainted by the knowledge of what he had been capable of all along. "We need to see you," my father said finally. "We need to talk about this in person, as a family." They arrived at my apartment an hour later, both looking as if they had aged years in the space of our phone conversation. My mother's eyes were red and swollen from crying, and my father moved like a man who had been physically beaten. We sat around the same kitchen table where Marcus had threatened me just hours earlier, the chair where he had sat now seeming to emanate a malevolent presence even in his absence. "Show us the recording," my father said without preamble. "If you're going to destroy our family with these accusations, we need to hear Marcus say these things himself." Officer Walsh had left me with a copy of the audio recording for exactly this purpose, knowing that my parents would need to hear Marcus's own words before they could accept the truth about their son. I played the entire 40-minute conversation, watching their faces as Marcus's mask slipped away and his true nature emerged in all its calculating cruelty. When Marcus's voice came through the speakers, describing his plan to make my death look like suicide, my mother doubled over as if she had been physically struck. When he admitted to the insurance policy and his financial motives, my father's hands clenched into fists on the table. By the time we reached his threat about prison not being forever and family being family, both of my parents looked like they were staring into an abyss that had opened up in the middle of their living room. "That's not our son," my mother whispered when the recording ended. "That can't be our Marcus. That's someone else, someone sick and twisted." "Mom, it is Marcus," I said gently. "It's who he's always been underneath the act he put on for all of us. The psychological evaluation in his file shows he's been this way for years, probably his whole adult life. We just never saw it because he was good at hiding it." My father stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot where Marcus's car had been parked just hours earlier when he came to threaten me.
All those times he asked for money, he said slowly, as if working through a complex equation. All those stories about bad luck and unfair bosses and business deals that fell through. We kept bailing him out because we thought he just needed help getting on his feet. "He was using us," my mother said, her voice hollow with realization. "Every family dinner, every holiday, every time he hugged us or told us he loved us, he was just working an angle." The next few hours were spent going through years of memories and interactions, re-examining Marcus's behavior through the lens of what we now knew about his true nature. Incidents that had seemed like normal sibling rivalry or temporary lapses in judgment now appeared in a much more sinister light. His tendency to borrow money and never repay it, his habit of manipulating family members against each other, his complete lack of genuine empathy or remorse when his actions hurt others. "What happens now?" my mother asked as dawn began to break outside my windows. "Now we wait for the trial," I replied. The district attorney says it should be a relatively quick process given the strength of the evidence. Marcus will probably be offered a plea bargain, but Officer Walsh thinks he's too narcissistic to accept responsibility for his actions. My father turned from the window, his face haggard but resolute. "We'll testify if we need to," he said. "If our testimony helps put him away for what he tried to do to you, then that's what we'll do." The trial began 6 weeks later, and it was every bit as devastating as I had expected it to be. Marcus had indeed refused all plea bargain offers, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. His court-appointed attorney had tried to build a defense around the idea that Marcus was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions, but the prosecution's presentation of the evidence made that strategy untenable. Mrs. Chen was the prosecution's star witness. Her testimony delivered with the precision and authority of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. She described exactly what she had seen from her bench outside the post office, her words painting a clear picture of deliberate violence disguised as accidental tragedy. When Marcus's attorney tried to suggest that her age might have affected her perception or memory, she responded with such dignified authority that even the defense seemed embarrassed by the line of questioning. The traffic camera footage was played for the jury multiple times, each viewing making Marcus's deliberate actions more obvious and undeniable. Expert witnesses explained the physics of what the video showed, demonstrating that my fall could only have resulted from the kind of forceful push that Marcus had delivered, not from any accidental stumbling or failed rescue attempt. But it was the recording from my apartment that sealed Marcus's fate. Hearing his own voice describing his plan to make my death look like suicide, admitting to the insurance policy, and threatening me with future violence left no room for doubt about his intentions or his complete lack of remorse. The jury listened in horrified silence as Marcus's true personality emerged from the speakers, his cold calculation and casual cruelty shocking even seasoned court personnel. Marcus himself was a disaster as a witness in his own defense. His narcissism and inability to accept responsibility made him combative and arrogant on the stand, alienating the jury with his obvious lies and his complete lack of empathy for the harm he had tried to cause. When the prosecutor asked him directly if he felt any remorse for pushing me into traffic, his response was a rambling justification that focused entirely on his own financial problems and made no reference to my well-being or survival. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge sentenced Marcus to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his complete lack of remorse and his threats of future violence made him too dangerous to ever release back into society. As the bailiff led Marcus away in shackles, he turned to look at our family one last time. There was no sorrow in his expression, no regret or love or recognition of the pain he had caused. There was only the cold fury of someone who had been caught and punished for crimes he felt entirely justified in committing. It was the face of a stranger, someone who had never really been part of our family, despite sharing our name and our history. The aftermath of the trial was a strange mixture of relief and profound sadness. Justice had been served, and Marcus would never be able to hurt me or anyone else again. But the family I had grown up in was gone forever, replaced by something smaller and more fragile, built on the shared trauma of discovering that one of our own had been a predator disguised as a protector. My parents struggled with guilt and self-recrimination, wondering how they had failed to see Marcus's true nature and questioning every decision they had made in raising him. I spent months in therapy, working through not just the trauma of the attacks themselves, but the deeper psychological damage of learning that someone I had loved unconditionally had never really existed at all. But there were also unexpected gifts that emerged from the wreckage. My relationship with my parents deepened in ways I had never anticipated, built on a new foundation of complete honesty and mutual support. We learned to talk about difficult truths instead of maintaining comfortable illusions, and our love for each other grew stronger for having survived such a devastating test. Mrs. Chen became an unexpected friend, her courage in speaking the truth inspiring me to be more honest and direct in all my relationships. She taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their lies, even when telling the truth is painful and complicated. Most importantly, I learned that survival isn't just about escaping physical danger. It's about having the courage to face difficult truths, to hold people accountable for their actions, and to choose reality over comfortable fantasies, no matter how much it hurts to let those fantasies go. Marcus is serving his sentence at a maximum security prison 300 miles away. I've never visited him, and I never will. He's written letters that I've thrown away unopened, and he's asked other family members to intercede on his behalf. But I've learned that some relationships are too toxic to salvage, and some people are too dangerous to forgive. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to recognize when someone in your life is a threat rather than a blessing, and to take whatever steps are necessary to protect yourself and the people you truly care about. Family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who genuinely want you to be safe, happy, and alive to see another day. And sometimes the strongest way to honor that family is to make sure that the people who threaten it face the consequences of their choices, no matter how much it hurts or how complicated it makes your life. Because in the end, the truth really will set you free, even when it first destroys everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. The months following Marcus's conviction brought unexpected complications that I hadn't anticipated during the intensity of the investigation and trial. While justice had been served in the legal sense, the ripple effects of his crimes continued to spread through every aspect of my life and my family's existence, creating new challenges that required different kinds of strength and resilience than I had needed during the immediate crisis. The first major issue emerged when I returned to work at Children's Memorial Hospital. My colleagues had heard about the accident and the subsequent trial through local news coverage, but the reality of working closely with someone who had survived a family member's attempt at murder proved more complicated than anyone had expected. Well-meaning coworkers would stop mid-sentence when discussing family gatherings or sibling relationships, suddenly remembering my situation and becoming awkwardly apologetic about topics that had once been routine small talk. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the head of pediatrics and my direct supervisor, called me into her office during my second week back to discuss what she delicately referred to as workplace integration challenges. She was a compassionate woman who had always been supportive of her staff, but even she struggled with how to address the elephant in the room that my situation had created. "Serena, I want you to know that your position here has never been in question," she began carefully. "Your work has always been exemplary, and what happened to you doesn't change that in any way. But I'm concerned about the impact this might be having on your ability to work with families, especially given the nature of what you've been through." Her concern wasn't entirely unfounded. Working with families in crisis had always been one of my strengths as a pediatric nurse, but I found myself analyzing family dynamics with a new and sometimes troubling intensity. When parents seemed overly controlling, or when siblings displayed aggressive behavior towards patients, I caught myself wondering about hidden motives and potential dangers that might not actually exist.
The hypervigilance that had helped me survive Marcus's attacks was now interfering with my ability to trust and connect with the families I was meant to help. I think I might benefit from some additional counseling focused specifically on work-related triggers, I told Dr. Hernandez. I don't want my personal trauma to compromise my ability to care for these children and their families. She immediately arranged for me to work with Dr. Michael Chen, no relation to Mrs. Eleanor Chen, who specialized in helping healthcare workers process trauma and maintain professional effectiveness. Dr. Chen's approach was practical and grounded, focusing on techniques for compartmentalizing personal experiences while remaining emotionally available for patients and their families. The goal isn't to forget what happened to you or to stop being appropriately cautious, he explained during our first session. It's to develop the ability to distinguish between reasonable professional skepticism and trauma-based hypervigilance that could interfere with your clinical judgment. Meanwhile, my parents were struggling with their own complicated grief process. They were mourning not just the loss of the son they thought they had known, but also the loss of their fundamental confidence in their own parenting and their ability to understand the people closest to them. My mother, Elena, had always prided herself on being intuitive about her children's needs and emotions. Learning that she had been completely deceived by Marcus for years left her questioning every maternal instinct she had ever trusted. "How did I miss it?" she asked me repeatedly during our weekly dinners, which had become a new tradition since the trial ended.
How could I not see that my own son was capable of murder? What kind of mother does that make me? My father, Roberto, dealt with his grief differently but no less intensely. He threw himself into research, reading everything he could find about antisocial personality disorder, family violence, and the warning signs he felt he should have recognized. He created detailed timelines of Marcus's behavior going back to childhood, searching for patterns and red flags that might have predicted his eventual violence. "Look at this," he would say, spreading newspaper clippings and printed articles across their kitchen table. "It says here that children who torture animals often develop into violent adults. Do you remember Marcus ever hurting pets or wild animals when he was young?" These conversations were necessary for their healing process, but they were also exhausting and emotionally draining for all of us. We were trying to make sense of something that fundamentally didn't make sense, to find logical explanations for behavior that was rooted in psychological pathology rather than normal human motivation. The financial aftermath of Marcus's crimes added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. The life insurance company initially refused to cancel the policy he had taken out on me, claiming that his conviction didn't automatically void the contract. It took 3 months and the threat of legal action before they agreed to terminate the policy and return the premiums he had paid. More problematically, several of Marcus's creditors began pursuing my parents for repayment of debts he had incurred while living in their basement. While they weren't legally responsible for his obligations, some of the debts involved property and assets that belonged to the family, creating complicated legal tangles that required expensive attorney consultations to resolve. "It's like he's still finding ways to hurt us, even from prison," my mother said bitterly as we sorted through another stack of collection notices and legal documents. "Even locked up, he's still causing problems and costing us money." The extended family dynamics proved even more challenging than I had anticipated. My Aunt Carmen, my father's sister who lived in Phoenix, had initially been supportive and horrified by Marcus's actions. But as time passed and the immediate shock wore off, she began expressing doubts about the strength of the evidence and suggesting that Marcus might have been set up or unfairly prosecuted. "I just can't believe that little boy who used to build sandcastles with me at the beach could grow up to be a murderer," she said during a particularly difficult phone conversation 6 months after the trial. "Are you absolutely sure there isn't some other explanation for what happened?" These conversations with extended family members who hadn't seen the evidence or heard Marcus's recorded confession were incredibly frustrating and hurtful. They forced me to relive the details of his attacks and defend the validity of my own experiences, as if surviving attempted murder wasn't traumatic enough without having to convince people that it had actually happened. My cousin David, who had driven up from San Diego with a care package immediately after my accident, became increasingly distant as the true story emerged. He had been close to Marcus growing up, and I think he felt betrayed not just by Marcus's actions, but by the family's decision to pursue prosecution rather than handling the matter privately somehow. "Couldn't you have gotten him help instead of sending him to prison?" David asked during one uncomfortable family gathering. "Maybe he was having a mental breakdown or something. Did you really have to destroy his entire life?" These questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both the severity of Marcus's crimes and the nature of antisocial personality disorder. The people asking them seemed to believe that attempted murder was the kind of problem that could be solved with therapy and family support, rather than recognizing that Marcus's actions had been calculated, premeditated, and likely to be repeated if he remained free. Dr. Chen helped me develop responses to these challenging conversations that allowed me to maintain boundaries while still preserving relationships that were important to me. "You can't control other people's reactions to your trauma," he reminded me, "but you can control how much energy you invest in trying to convince them of realities they're not ready to accept." One unexpected positive development came through my connection with Mrs. Eleanor Chen, whose courage in speaking the truth had made justice possible. She began visiting me regularly, and our friendship deepened beyond the shared experience of that terrible Tuesday afternoon. At 73, she had a lifetime of wisdom about resilience, truth-telling, and the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult or unpopular. "People don't want to believe that evil can exist in their own families," she told me during one of our afternoon tea sessions in her tidy apartment.
It's easier to blame the victim or make excuses for the perpetrator than to face the reality that someone they love is capable of terrible things. Mrs. Chen had faced similar family dynamics decades earlier when she had testified against her own brother-in-law in a domestic violence case that had torn her extended family apart. "My sister didn't speak to me for 5 years after I testified," she said. "She chose to believe her husband's lies rather than accept that he had been beating her children. But eventually, the truth came out, and she thanked me for having the courage to speak up when she couldn't." Her stories helped me understand that the resistance I was encountering from some family members wasn't really about me or even about Marcus. It was about their own fear and inability to process the reality that violence can emerge from the most unexpected places, including within families that seem normal and loving from the outside. The first anniversary of the attack approached with a weight I hadn't anticipated. October had always been my favorite month, with its changing leaves and crisp air reminding me of new beginnings and fresh possibilities. But as that Tuesday in October grew closer, I found myself struggling with anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a hypervigilance that interfered with my daily routines. My therapist, Dr. Serena Martinez, suggested that I might benefit from participating in a support group for survivors of family violence. The idea initially made me uncomfortable because I had always thought of support groups as something for other people whose situations were somehow different from or more serious than mine. But as the anniversary date approached and my symptoms intensified, I decided to give it a try.
The group met weekly in a community center conference room, a diverse collection of people whose only common bond was having survived violence at the hands of family members. There was Janet, whose husband had tried to poison her for insurance money; Michael, whose teenage son had attacked him with a baseball bat during an argument about curfew; Lisa, whose sister had hired someone to break her legs over a property dispute. Listening to their stories helped me understand that family violence was far more common than I had realized, and that the particular combination of love, betrayal, and grief that I was experiencing was shared by many other survivors. They understood the complicated emotions involved in simultaneously mourning someone you had loved and celebrating their imprisonment. They knew what it felt like to have other family members question your decisions or suggest that you were being too harsh or unforgiving. The hardest part for me was realizing that the person who hurt me had never really existed, said Janet during one particularly intense group session. "I spent years grieving for a husband who had been an illusion, a character he played to manipulate me. Learning to separate the real person from the act he put on was crucial to my healing." Her words resonated deeply with my own experience. I had been mourning the loss of a brother who had never actually existed, grieving for a relationship that had been built on lies and manipulation from the very beginning. Understanding that my love for Marcus had been real, even though Marcus himself had been largely fictitious, helped me process the complex emotions I was experiencing. The support group also helped me develop strategies for dealing with well-meaning but hurtful comments from people who didn't understand the dynamics of family violence. They taught me phrases like, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm comfortable with my decision," and "The person who hurt me made their own choices, and I'm not responsible for the consequences of those choices." As I approached the 2-year anniversary of Marcus's attack, I realized that my healing process had been far more complex and lengthy than I had initially expected. The legal justice had been relatively swift, but the emotional and psychological work of rebuilding my life and relationships was ongoing. I had learned that trauma recovery isn't linear, that healing happens in waves rather than straight lines, and that some effects of violence can take years to fully understand and address. One of the most significant changes in my life was a new relationship with David Kim, a social worker I had met through my volunteer work with a local domestic violence shelter. David understood the complexities of family trauma in ways that my previous romantic partners had not, and he was patient with my hypervigilance and occasional anxiety attacks. He had his own history of family dysfunction, though not involving violence, and we bonded over our shared understanding that love alone isn't enough to overcome serious psychological pathology. "Some people are just broken in ways that can't be fixed," David said during one of our early conversations about our respective family histories. "Recognizing that isn't giving up on them, it's accepting reality and protecting yourself from further harm."
Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, built on foundations of honesty and mutual respect, rather than the kind of intense emotional dependency that had characterized some of my earlier relationships. Having survived Marcus's betrayal, I was much more cautious about trusting people, but I was also clearer about what healthy relationships should look like. My parents' healing process continued to evolve as well. They had eventually stopped trying to find explanations or warning signs they had missed, accepting that some people are simply skilled at deception and that they couldn't have predicted or prevented Marcus's eventual violence. They became active volunteers with a local organization that supported families affected by domestic violence, channeling their grief into helping other people navigate similar situations. "We can't change what Marcus did or who he really was," my father said during one of our family dinners, "but we can use what we learned to help other families recognize the warning signs we missed and get help before someone gets hurt." Their volunteer work brought them into contact with other parents who had discovered that their children were capable of serious violence, and these relationships provided them with the kind of understanding and support that well-meaning friends and relatives simply couldn't offer. They learned that their experience, while devastating, wasn't unique, and that it was possible to rebuild family bonds even after such a fundamental betrayal of trust. The ripple effects of Marcus's crimes continued to surface in unexpected ways years after his conviction. I discovered that he had been manipulating other family relationships for years, telling different relatives contradictory stories about various family members, and creating conflicts that had seemed mysterious at the time. His removal from the family dynamic actually improved several relationships that had been strained by his subtle manipulation and troublemaking. My relationship with my cousin David eventually improved once he had his own child and began to understand the fierce protectiveness that parents feel toward their children. He apologized for questioning my decision to prosecute Marcus, acknowledging that he would do whatever was necessary to protect his daughter from anyone who tried to harm her, even if that person was a family member. These evolving relationships taught me that healing from family trauma is often a collective process that affects entire family systems over time. Some relationships grow stronger through shared adversity, while others reveal themselves to have been built on foundations too weak to withstand serious challenges. Learning to accept these changes without taking them personally was an important part of my recovery process. As I write this, 5 years have passed since Marcus pushed me into traffic and changed all of our lives forever. He remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life, and I have no desire to maintain any contact with him. He is part of my past and my story, but he is not part of my future or my family as it exists now. The family I have today is smaller than the one I grew up in, but it's built on truth rather than comfortable illusions. My parents and I have relationships that are deeper and more honest than they were before we learned what Marcus was capable of. My marriage to David is grounded in mutual respect and genuine care, rather than dependency or fantasy. Mrs. Chen continues to be a treasured friend whose wisdom and courage inspire me daily. I've learned that survival isn't just about escaping immediate physical danger. It's about having the courage to face difficult truths, hold people accountable for their actions, and choose reality over comfortable lies, no matter how much it hurts to let those illusions go. It's about understanding that some relationships are too toxic to salvage, and that protecting yourself isn't selfish or cruel. Most importantly, I've learned that speaking up about violence and abuse isn't just about seeking justice for yourself. It's about protecting future victims and refusing to enable dangerous people by keeping their secrets. Mrs. Chen's witness statement didn't just save my life by exposing Marcus's first attack, it potentially saved the lives of his future victims by ensuring that he would never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else. The courage to speak truth in the face of family pressure, social expectations, and personal cost isn't something that comes naturally to most people. But sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for the people who might be harmed if dangerous individuals are allowed to continue their destructive behavior without consequences. Family isn't just about blood relations or shared history. It's about the people who genuinely want you to be safe, happy, and alive to see another day. And sometimes, the strongest way to honor that real family is to make sure that the people who threaten it face the consequences of their choices, no matter how complicated or painful that process might be. The truth really will set you free, even when it first destroys everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. But the freedom that comes from living authentically, surrounded by people who genuinely care about your well-being, is worth whatever it costs to achieve it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.